How to write a great fantasy or space opera story. Greetings and salutations. My name is Gordon Preston. I'm the author of Zendragon, Book 1 of the Dragon Soul Cycle. Zendragon won an Ozma Award for Best Heroic Fantasy, and the prestigious Kirkus Reviews also liked my book. You may have seen my free audiobook for Dragonsworn, or my YouTube videos about superhero and Star Wars movies. Even though I'm an author, I'm focusing on screenplay and novelette writing advice because I'm way better at writing dialogue than I am prose, and scripts are much more focused and integrated than novels. It's a lot easier to come up with plot for scripts because they're so short and fast-paced, and usually only have 3 acts. With novels you're given a lot more room to meander, with episodic subplots or long descriptions of setting and world building or introspection or whatever. Writing begins with brainstorming, and when you brainstorm you think of a variety of elements, characters, which includes individual traits and flaws, setting details, magic or fantastic tech powers, and premise and plot. What you really want when you brainstorm are a handful of pivotal character and relationship arcs. They will inform the direction of your story the most. It could be something like this character betrays them, which could lead to him corrupting someone else, and then the heroes must redeem the fallen one. Character and relationship arcs will form the core of your story, so start thinking on that level for interesting twists and turns. You could also begin with great scenes and dialogue, where you understand the conflict even though you're not sure how it will connect to the rest of the story. I have written the odd scene out of sequence, but usually I write in a much more linear manner. Stories begin and end with character, along with dialogue. It's the single most important aspect of any story. Great stories are founded on great characters, almost without exception. When creating characters you should always consider their relationship to other characters, and their inherent differences, and how those differences could generate conflict. You might have a group of friends going on a quest, but what you don't want is everyone getting along harmoniously. If at all possible you want to generate internal conflict within the group, between characters, because internal conflict will bring your characters to vivid life. A character is often at his best when he's arguing, attacking and defending with words, the argument escalating as the characters take turns dominating the discussion, until one or the other finally wins. The best drama has high stakes, but even a low-stakes argument can be great where the stakes are simply the friendship itself on the line. This applies to romances as well. A great romance needs great conflict, because the audience will want the characters to get together, while the story is forcing them apart, and this tension of will they won't they get together will make your romance tremendously exciting, and their eventual hookup tremendously satisfying. Great conflict will make their eventual union feel earned. Another thing that may help you with character is creating flaws for your character. Creating flaws creates problems, then the story becomes about overcoming those problems, or perhaps struggling and failing to overcome them. Flaws are really great for creating great drama, and also internal conflict within the flawed character themselves. If you make the struggle to overcome the flaw believable and satisfying, the eventual success will be tremendously cathartic, and the audience will share the hero's triumph in a deeply emotional way. Thorin Oakenshield from the Hobbit movies is a fantastic example of a flawed character. His anger and unforgiveness towards the elves almost leads to him killing Bilbo and fighting the elves, and he has to overcome his flaw and forgive Bilbo and accept the elves as his allies to defeat the orcs. You also generally want your character to be sympathetic, especially if you're writing a hero's story. When your hero evokes sympathy, the audience will connect with them emotionally, and become invested in their journey. This is a big problem for beginning writers, who often fail to make their characters sympathetic. Don't get me wrong, stories with unsympathetic characters can also be great. In my own stories Zendragon, the hero Winteroo is a bit of an arrogant prick. He's not that likable. His arc was to go from being unsympathetic, and through struggling and hardship to become sympathetic. But by creating unsympathetic characters there is the danger the audience will not give your story a chance, so beware. Sympathetic characters are generally relatable, we can see ourselves in them, and therefore we identify with them. They can also be admirable, especially if they're highly moral, as is the case with Captain America. Indeed, this is a big part of what makes superhero movies so appealing. We live today in a world without heroes. The closest thing we have are famous celebrities and sports heroes, but they are generally shallow and not particularly admirable. We only like them for superficial reasons. But superheroes care deeply about the welfare of their fellow man, indeed they're willing to lay down their lives to defend humanity. This was the reason superhero movies became so huge, because people are starving for uplifting icons to admire. We desperately crave an escape from our shallow and selfish and cynical society. It's also the reason why many people cleave to religion, because Jesus and the Buddha were the closest things we had to real superheroes, and why they're so deeply admired and loved. One trick to evoke sympathy is to have your character suffer an ordeal, perhaps the loss of a loved one, so we share the pain of their grief, and in that moment of emotional bonding we grow to care about them. This is like in Guardians of the Galaxy, where young Peter Cole's mother dies of cancer, and we share his pain and grow to like him because of the hardship he endured. An equally important element to great characters is great conflict. As a writer, conflict is the prey you will always be hunting. You will become obsessed with finding ways to put different characters at each other's throats, whether those two people are friends or enemies. Conflict is what drives your story, and if you're struggling to come up with plot, what you're really struggling with is finding problems or obstacles for your characters to overcome while generating conflict. Many people praise Save the Cat and the three-act structure. I've never actually read it myself, but I have read the beat sheet. I do agree with the story beats, I just don't agree with the precise timing. It's good if you're a beginner looking for a framework to hang your story on, but I've never needed it. I've written many stories with slightly unusual narrative structures. I don't worry too much about adhering precisely to any checklist system. Like you're supposed to spend the first act just getting to know the characters and showing them in their native element while you set up the rest of the conflict, but I usually just dive immediately into the inciting incident and the conflict. Also, people's definitions of what an act even is differ, and I prefer defining it as facing a turning point where you set out in a new direction and pass the point of no return. Some of my stories have many acts, so I don't pay it much mind. One thing that's crucial to a great story is narrative drive. That's a term John Truby came up with to describe a plot with escalating consequences, the connective tissue between the past and the present. Without narrative drive, you will have an episodic plot with disconnected elements. An example of this is in Dark Knight Rises, where Bruce is held captive in the prison, and he's separate from the rest of the plot. So sometimes it is necessary to break from narrative drive, but you want to avoid doing that as much as you can. Escalating, integrated consequences and dealing with them is what makes a story really compelling. Another way of looking at it is narrative drive comes from complications, where you solve one problem only to create another one. Brandon Mull, the fantasy writer, has a neat system for generating plot. You have your characters, and first the troubles come, then they make decisions based on those troubles, then they deal with the consequences of those decisions, then that leads to more troubles, and so on in a long sequence of cycles. This is a really handy system for overcoming writer's block, because you know precisely what you're looking for: troubles, decisions and consequences. Another thing to bear in mind when you're constructing a plot is that plots expand when you add more characters, so if your plot is too short, the best fix is to add more characters. This can be tricky because you can't add characters willy-nilly, they have to fit in with the overarching conflict somehow, or your story will be random and disjointed. Another trick to expanding plot is the try-fail cycle. This is where the heroes use some ploy to defeat the villain, or overcome an obstacle, but they fail. This can be a great way of expanding a plot if you've run out of ideas. Empire Strikes Back is probably the best example of a try-fail cycle, where Luke battles Vader and loses. Usually the middle part of a trilogy will end in defeat, before the heroes rally for the final confrontation. Try-fail cycle is also known as chasing the false goal, like in Phantom Menace, where Queen Amidala goes to the Senate to resolve her crisis with the Federation, only to fail and have to devise another plan. When you write epic fantasies and space operas, you usually need what I call macro conflict. Macro conflict is when you have two or more nations' armies clashing, although it might be lords or gangs or tribes or whatever. Basically two or more groups. If you want to get really good at macro conflict, I suggest you try playing strategic computer games. They will help you to think in terms of bases and marching armies and geostrategic positioning. Heroes of Might and Magic 3 and Warcraft 3 taught me how to think on a macro conflict level, so I suggest you find a strategy game you really like. Thinking on this scale will make your stories epic. Great opposition is essential to a great story. A hero is only as great as their nemesis. You always want your villain to be more powerful than the hero, and make the hero the underdog, so they have to work damn hard to overcome them, and their eventual success is immensely satisfying. Ideally, you want the villain to beat the hero again and again, so victory seems impossible, before their eventual triumph, or defeat if you're writing a tragedy, at the climax. You usually need multiple sources of conflict in order to drive a story. Conflict derived solely from the hero and the villain usually isn't enough. Conflict could come from society, like in Batman Begins, when the cops set out to stop Batman. Or like Dr. Crane, who seems like nothing more than a psychiatrist working at the mental ward, before he reveals he's the villain Scarecrow. John Truby has a neat system for generating opposition, called the four-corner conflict, with four opponents, where various foes not only conflict with the hero, but each other as well. You always want to create pivotal junctures, dilemmas where the hero must choose between one moral option or the other to win or lose. These junctures are usually moral decisions, where they must choose between the morally good option and the morally bad option, though the moral consequences of the decision may not be clearly evident. It could be between a selfish option and a selfless option, or the decision to seek revenge against your enemy, as opposed to focusing on protecting your friends from harm. These moral dilemmas will create powerful drama, and give your character agency, because they determine the direction of the plot with their choices. Your character can make bad decisions, in fact it encourages you to do this, because it will create problems for your character to deal with. A good example of a moral dilemma is in the first Spider-Man movie, where Peter is confronted with the choice of stopping a burglar, but he lets him go to spite the person he robbed, and that burglar ends up killing his uncle. Writing mysteries is a very demanding discipline, and perhaps the most difficult of all the story types. With a good mystery the hero is seeking a missing person or a criminal or whatever, and the plot becomes about gaining the clues leading to their eventual discovery. Usually with mysteries you always want at least two suspects, or red herrings, so you're never quite certain who the real culprit is, until the hero obtains the critical information that identifies the culprit at the end. Ideally you want whodunit mysteries to end in a dramatic confrontation, where both the hero and the villain are suspects in the crime, and the hero has to use argumentation to persuade the third party, which is usually a police officer, that the culprit is the guilty party. There are mysteries where you seek a missing person, and these types of mysteries rely on the suspect being questioned keeping some kind of secret, which must be solved to obtain the next clue and lead to the next phase of plot. Another type of mystery is the conspiracy plot, and this is one of my personal favorites, because the hero is essentially struggling and fighting to obtain information, and as their understanding of the missing information grows, the dimensions of the conspiracy becomes clear, until at the end the mastermind and his sinister agenda finally becomes apparent. Dialogue and drama. To me dialogue is the most important part of a story. Don't get me wrong, characters and conflict and plot are important, but dialogue is how you make those things shine. It's crucial to a great story. It's okay if when you begin your dialogue is clunky and on the nose, many of us begin that way, I certainly did. But as you write more stories and different situations you should grow the neural connections to write better and better dialogue. Great dialogue is insightful, and slightly surprising, it should come out of left field. The best dialogue is also metaphorical. Great script writers are adept at weaving great figures of speech into their dialogue, and creating unique metaphors that speak to the themes and subtext of the story. One of my favorite lines is from Two Towers, where Wormtongue speaks about Eowyn, saying she's like a morning of pale spring still clinging to winter's chill. Authors pour their metaphorical language into their prose, and this is what's known as voice, but screenplay writers focus solely on making their characters' dialogue great, which is why movie writers usually write the best dialogue, the most complex and interesting. Metaphors can be really complex and multidimensional in meaning. Drama is where you have two characters arguing, usually with something valuable at stake, whether it's some kind of prize or just the relationship itself. Great drama is built into the core of the story, like Black Panther where T'Challa's father exiled his nephew to avoid a succession struggle, and this choice comes back to kick T'Challa in the ass, and he sees his father's spirit and exclaims he will no longer do the wrong thing to hide Wakanda's strength from the world, he will do the right thing no matter what. Another great example of core drama is Avatar, where Jake Sully is a sleeper agent sent by the humans to infiltrate the Na'vi, and when the humans attack Jake reveals what he did to his lover Neytiri, and she abandons him. The only way he can regain her love is by taming the huge dragon creature and becoming Turok Makto. You don't always need core drama to tell a good story, but the best stories usually do. Another part of great dialogue is foreshadowing, where you speak to the future issues of the plot. This is like in Dark Knight when Harvey Dent says you either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. You have to be careful though, because dramatizing issues is tricky. You have to weigh the value of foreshadowing in order to create great drama, versus the need for surprises. Normally I value dramatization and foreshadowing more than surprises, but your mileage may vary. Ignore foreshadowing at your own peril. If you don't foreshadow any of the twists, it will result in really bland and inert dialogue as you seek instead to hoard information. This is a huge mistake, because if you can't make the intermediate stages of a story compelling, no one will care about your big twist at the end.